Yeah, let's get into some late planted corn and potential effects on yields. Back when we were putting this together, there was a look like we might get very late in planting. We were actually very early on. If you look at this red graph in here, the red line from USDA NASS is showing us that we had some, early on, we were very much ahead in planting, and then we hit into several rain events that took us out of the field for a couple of weeks and really slowed things down. We still ended up with almost 90% planted at June 1. That's a little bit under our 5-year average, but it was actually not that far off of what we saw in 2019. And so we've seen a couple of years here in a row where we're getting some corn planted into June in the state. And historically that you might think, well, that's just mostly silage corn, but that's not the case. There's actually some field corn that's getting into this category. And so we were curious about some of those issues there of what might happen in that type of scenario. But before I get over into the late planted question, I wanted to get into just planting dates in general. And so several years ago, I asked several farmers around the state to just send me planting dates and yields and acreages from their fields. And we took every field that I think was above 20 acres in size, and we put them all together into one graph to look at just planting date and corn yield, just to give us a better idea about what farmers were actually seeing in the field from season to season. This particular data set goes from 2003 to 2011. This is off of farmers' fields in central Kentucky. When we just pulled that grouping, we have a little bit of data from other parts of the state, but we had the majority of the data that came to us from this area of the state. And so I did the initial cut on the data, and then Dan put it into a really nice graph. And so that's what we're sharing with you here. If you look at this data set and fit this particular curve to it, what it suggests is that our ideal planting date starts somewhere around April 26th or 27th. And then really out until about June 2nd, we pretty much have a flat curve. We've got a plateau at this point. And so if you look at the actual data points, you can see that we have some really high yields. So these are relative grain yields. So what we did is each year, yields were a little bit different from year to year. And so we looked at the highest yield within a year, set that to 1, and then adjusted everything else accordingly. And you can see across that very top line, that 1, that we have some early April planting dates that got us to the high yield all the way out into the June planting dates to get us into the high yield category. And then you can see there's a massive range, and some of those early plantings where we've got lower yields, we may have had a freeze event come in or something, or maybe some other weather events that came in and hurt some of those yields early on, maybe some stand reductions for some other reasons. But overall, if you look at this, what it's suggesting to us is at least over that period of time, while we talk about April 15th as a start date for planting for central Kentucky, it looked like we were much better off to get into that last week of April and the first couple of weeks of May. So that would suggest that maybe we shouldn't push planting dates as much as we think on the corn side. Now, with that in mind, let's get into looking at some later planting. And so we did a couple of studies. We got most of our research that we got at Lexington planted ended up being on May 15th. We had a lot of starts and stops this year. We actually had a field, I think it was 2 weeks before this, Dan, where we planted a field. It was too wet, and so Dan made 2 passes with the planter. We put the planter back up. We came back out 2 weeks later, planted some crops, and sure enough, where we were out there 2 weeks earlier, we got sidewall compaction. And the 2 weeks in planting difference was only 1 growth stage in planting difference. And so May 15th became our on-time or early planting date for this year. Then we had one we did at June 8th, and we did another one at June 18th. And so the June 8th planting date is our late corn, and then the June 18th is the late corn. Hopefully we don't get into a copyright infringement with anyone on those categories, but that's what we're calling them for now. Now, if you look at this image, this was taken on July 7th. And in July 7th, the early corn, or the on-time corn, it's got leaf rolling going on. It's showing some signs of drought stress. The other two planting dates are not. And this is reflective of this corn was at V11, and it's at a higher demand for water than corn at V6 or V4. These are all studies that are side by side. In fact, if you look at the V6 image in the left, you can see the taller corn sort of off to the left in that image. That's the corn that you see in the first picture at V11. So this is all in that same field, same soil type, and same rotation, just differences in planting date. And so we're already seeing that the early planting date is going through a little bit more drought stress at that point in time. It gives us some indication of the water demand that we see as we get into peak water demand, which is right about now for most of the corn in the state. If we fast forward to July 15th, now the early corn, or the on-time corn's at V14, the June 8th corn's at V8, the June 18th is sitting at V6. And in this particular image, that particular day, not too much drought stress, maybe a little bit of curling at the very top of the leaves on the V14 corn. But otherwise, the crop overall had a couple rainfall events and was looking pretty good at this point. Now, both that V8 and V6 corn have now started reproductive development. The growing points above ground at V6 by V8, that dominant ear and the tassel have been formed, are starting their formation. And so any type of stress that goes on from this point out could affect reproductive development, could affect that ear, could affect the tassel. A lot of your herbicides tend to have cutoff somewhere between V6 and V8 in there as well. So those are some of the things that we're concerned about. And then on July 20th, yesterday, Julia Santoro, who works with my group, took these images. And so now that May 15th corn is at tassel. It's at its peak water demand. Any type of water stress right now is lethal to the crop. It's harmful to pollination. 100% hail damage at this point would give us zero yields. The corn crop is requiring roughly 0.3 of an inch of water a day right in through here. And so it's at very, very high demand for water. And if you look across the state, a lot of our corn is somewhere around VTR1 to R2. So it puts a tremendous amount of our crop at peak water demand right now. Over these next couple of weeks, this will really tell us what kind of crop we're going to end up with. And the other two are up to V10 and V8. And so they're slowly catching up. And so what Julia has done with some help from Ryan Murphy and some help from Dan as well, Ryan's an undergrad student working for us, they went in and they've been monitoring growth stages, and they're also looking at growing degree day accumulations. And so the blue line shows you the May 15th planting date, and you can see we're right up to VT. We've taken quite a few heat units to get there. This is more heat units than what it suggests the hybrid needs, but we've got a lot of heat units in here. And if you look at both the June plantings, you can see that they are hitting growth stages faster than what the May 15th corn did. And so one, we're getting a little bit more growing degree day accumulation because we're just simply getting warmer into July, late June and into July. But secondly, those two later planting dates are developing through the growth stages quicker than what the early corn did. And by quicker, quicker in time, but also taking fewer growing degree day units to get to those growth stages than the corn planted earlier. I want to double check that bottom graph. I think we're pulling data off of the UK Ag Weather Center's corn growing degree day calculation. I want to double check those values because those do seem quite a bit high for what a crop needs at this point in time with the growth stage. But either way, the relative difference is what to pay attention to here. And so corn that gets in late, that's certainly something that we often see is it tends to catch up or grow a little bit faster. And these two June planting dates are certainly showing us that they're growing faster in terms of number of days. They're also growing faster in terms of taking fewer heat units to get to each growth stage. That's important because we base a lot of crop growth and development on corn off of these heat units. And there's clearly some other factors that help determine that, not just the heat units. But here's part of the challenge. And so you can see right now, this is looking at the Drought Monitor for the Midwest. This was last Thursday. The next one will come out on this coming Thursday. And so we'll see what the update shows us. You can see a good chunk of the Midwest, half of Iowa, a lot of Indiana, a good amount of Ohio are all going through abnormally dry situations. Parts of Iowa are into moderate drought already last week. And each of these states have been tracking that way now for about 3 weeks. I think Missouri just popped up to abnormally dry last week. So far, Kentucky has been, thankfully, we've been okay in terms of our water, but the challenge is we've also been hot. And so this was the max temperature taken basically ending the morning of 7/20. So the morning, yesterday morning, looking at the max temperature the day before, and we're well into the 90s. Our min temperatures are good, so we're doing okay on the minimum temperature side. We'd like to see those a little bit lower, ideally to help with corn. But these max temperatures mean that we don't just need adequate moisture. We probably need above adequate moisture to try to keep up with the temperature demands that we're seeing in that situation. So you asked me which is the best planting date to use. I mean, historically, the May 15th planting date should be the best, but that crop is going through pollination right now. And those later planting dates, if we caught a break in weather, we had a little bit of a dip in the temperature, maybe a little more rainfall, I mean, they have a chance to actually have a decent pollination, maybe go through a bit less stress in there. And so that gets us to maybe this final point on yield factors. While planting date is certainly a factor in determining yield, there's a lot of other factors that come into play. Planting conditions. I mentioned earlier sidewall compaction. We could have planted even 2 weeks earlier, that 1st of May, but we would have caused sidewall compaction, and that corn would have been behind from the start, would not have been nearly as good as any of the planting dates that I just showed you. Weed control is a big player, and you're going to hear some more about that next week. If you got weed competition in there, a lot of this other stuff doesn't really matter at that point. At this point in time, weeds will compete for light. They certainly compete for water. We don't need additional water competition right now over the last couple of weeks of what we've been dealing with. Diseases, insects, nutrient availability, which Edwin discussed. Kirsten talked about the diseases, southern rust, if it comes in. Those later planted corns are much higher risk for problems with southern rust just because of where they are in their development stages. It's probably something we're going to have to monitor on those 2 late planting dates. And if we don't control southern rust in those 2 late planting dates, I would suspect they would be hurt tremendously more by the southern rust that's coming in right now. Soil compaction is a big one. We sort of mentioned that one with the sidewall compaction. If you get soil compaction in the field, everything else doesn't matter. It will trump anything else that you're trying to do. Certainly cloud cover, rainfall timeliness, rainfall amount, your daytime temperature, your night temperatures, your relative humidity. The dew that we're getting in the mornings right now is extremely helpful for most of the state. And then things we don't have as much control of are deer. Deer are a big problem, particularly on smaller fields. You know, we have about 1.5 million acres of corn in Kentucky. We've got somewhere around 12 million acres of wooded area. And so particularly these smaller fields essentially are food plots for deer. And so that's a massive challenge for some growers around the state. And we've got a specialist working on some of those issues, and then things like hail and some other factors in there as well. So all of these factors go together to affect what our final corn yield is. But when you put them all together and you assume that you're controlling for all of these as best as possible, we'd certainly want to be in that April, May planting date for most of the state, depending upon where you are. Except when we look at that farmer data, it suggests maybe we should be at the later end of our windows for planting rather than the early end. Or look at it a different way. If the weather's good and it's early and we're able to plant, we go ahead and plant. But if the weather's bad, not to stress out about it. We still have a chance to get good yield potential as we get later into that window for planting. And so and if we do plant late, you know, that later corn will catch up a little bit in there. And ultimately on any of these crops, it's getting that the good temperatures, rainfalls during seed fill. The other issue on late planted corn would be if that corn's trying to go through field dry down. As the days get shorter and the temperatures get a lot cooler, field dry down becomes more complicated. And so anybody that planted corn in May or in June anybody who planted corn in June probably needs to assume they're going to need to harvest corn wet and get it dried. To assume they can get it to field dry properly and maintain good quality is probably too high of a risk. We really, really appreciate your attendance. We appreciate the hard work that you all do to try to grow a crop of corn and soybeans that you're, by and large, what I find to be an enjoyment is at how well educated farmers are in Kentucky, how well they understand their soils and the challenges of some of their soils, and probably even more so how much they want to protect those soils and how they recognize that crop rotations and minimum tillage or no tillage are just, they're sound environmental practices, but they're also sound production practices. And I think all of us consider it a privilege to work with you and for you. We really appreciate your attendance today. We appreciate you taking some time out of your days to spend with us. We appreciate your comments here as well. With that, we hope that each of you stays safe and stays healthy. We hope to see you back here again next week. And I'm excited for the day when we can all talk in person. With that, we hope you all have a really good day.